The interview itself was designed to help to evaluate the program. So I kind of took that as my main research questions were, what are the forces that are driving prescribers to use unnecessary antibiotics, and then is the program addressing those issues? So the interview involved questions having to do with the program itself and attitudes towards the program, but then there were other questions that were specifically asking, why are you prescribing unnecessary antibiotics? I asked all of the providers that I talked to, how often do you think that patients here receive unnecessary antibiotics? And whatever their answer was, I generally followed up with, why do you think that that occurs? And by and large, the responses would not surprise anyone. It was attributed to patient demand, that patients wanted the antibiotics and so they gave them to them. But I thought that that was sort of interesting in light of the way that we think about prescribers as being responsible for their antibiotics. So in the poster, what I was really trying to get at was this tension, this almost contradiction between the notion that providers are responsible for the antibiotics, but that the providers believe that the patients were the reason they were getting too many of them. If you just ask them what is causing the prescribing, the providers would say, well, it's patient demand, it's because the patients want them. But I wanted to follow up with that to see, like, what is it exactly about that patient demand that sort of forces the hand of these providers, that forces them to, to use the title to abdicate their responsibility for prescribing over to the patients themselves. And so listening to those responses, there were a few themes that really emerged. One was patient satisfaction scores, which probably wouldn't surprise a lot of people. But in many cases, providers' salaries are tied to their patient satisfaction scores. So when they are looking through their scores at the end of the day and they're seeing that they were marked very low, and then there's a comment, I spent all this time waiting for an antibiotic and they wouldn't give me one, then that is something that the provider takes to heart, and it's something that they worry about the next time that they feel like a patient wants antibiotics. I also heard providers would talk about sort of feeling obligated to patients. So patients would say, I spent an hour waiting in the waiting room, I paid this huge copay, I took off work and all of this so that I could come here and get an antibiotic, and you're not giving me anything. So in those cases, the provider felt guilty. They felt like they needed to give something to this patient, and oftentimes that would be what they wanted. They would want those antibiotics. But the thing that I guess surprised me the most was when providers would talk about feeling this need to give the patient something, and what they would do was sometimes prescribe them, say, a Z-Pak, with the justification that, well, antibiotic resistance has reached the point where this Z-Pak is ineffective anyway, so I might as well give them a Z-Pak, which is interesting that antibiotics would basically be used in that case as sort of a placebo, or just to sort of satisfy them. Another thing that I noticed, and this goes right into the main theme of the poster, is that providers would talk about when they were worried about patients being upset, they would try to talk them out of it. They would try to explain why they don't really need antibiotics, but if the patient would not budge, if they still continued to insist, what they would often talk about doing was writing a script for the patient and saying, I don't recommend that you fill this, but it's up to you. The ball is in your court now. And they would say, that was a weight off of my conscience. So in that case, they were literally abdicating their responsibility as the prescriber to the patient.